So for everyone watching, hi, my name is Kendra, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel on why do open science in grad school. So first, I'm just going to briefly explain what is open science, in case anyone doesn't know. So open science can be thought of as an umbrella term covering many different practices. So this can include sharing research objects such as data, code, lab notebooks, and papers. But it can also include sharing open educational resources, citizen science, and promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. And many grad students, especially at McGill, may have heard of the word open science, but may not know whether it's something that they should be doing or how exactly they could do it, especially if perhaps their lab doesn't promote it openly. And in this panel, we'll be talking about what are the benefits and the challenges of doing open science, and we'll talk about how you can start as a grad student. So we're very excited to have these 6 panelists today. And we're going to be introducing ourselves briefly, and then we'll have a discussion with some prepared questions, and then we'll end with questions from the audience. So panelists, first, I'll introduce your title, and then could you give me 1 or 2 ways that you participate in open science? And in the spirit of openness, could you also mention 1 academic failure that you might have experienced in your career? So first of all, starting with Patricia Silveira. Dr. Silveira is the, is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University. Go ahead, Patricia, you can now introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel. It's very interesting to be here. So as Kendra said, I'm assistant professor at McGill, Department of Psychiatry. So I think that the most important way in which I participate in open science is I'm a big user of open science. So several of our protocols today in the lab make use of open data sets for bioinformatics and data in phenotype, genotype. So I'm, of course, a big fan of the movement. We try as much as possible to contribute as well. And in terms of a failure in the career, I think it's a very interesting question. Thanks for bringing that up here. I think it's great to be able to talk about this. Hard to pick one because, you know, it's an intense career and we have many no's and many doors that are closed. Often you have to learn how to deal with it. I think that one that was particularly interesting for me and somewhat recent and that I put on the material there is that it took me a long time to really understand that letters of support are critical for anything that you do. So for a long time, I thought, okay, it's nice to have them in your grant so that people support your idea and your proposal. But they're actually critical, like you have to have them. And for me, it was it was a tough learning. So I missed a few grants because of that.
Thank you very much. All right, next we'll move on to Andrea Coyotini, who is the liaison librarian for McGill for the departments in the Faculty of Medicine, including neurology, neuroscience, neurosurgery, and the integrated program in neuroscience.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, so I mean, librarians, we do our own research sort of in our own unique kind of way. So one of the ways I sort of try and participate in open science is making the research that like the final products open and available in repositories. And so librarians, we love conferences, and we do most of our research presentations in a conference setting. We do write papers, but conferences is really where we share a lot of our stuff. And so you know, the posters I've done and the presentations I've done are in institutional repositories here at McGill and at University of Alberta, where I was before. So that's thinking, I want people to think more openly about your research and what you're producing and where that can go and live after. In terms of academic failures, I'd say it's a challenge for me. It's translating all of those conference things that I do into papers. I'm really, really bad at that and just taking things to that sort of next level. So that is something I struggle with immensely. So for grad students, I totally get the feeling. I'm trying to make that leap from a pre-conference presentation to full paper.
Thank you. That's great. I'm sure that's something a lot of grad students have on their mind. So it's good to hear that it's something common with other people working in academia.
Absolutely.
All right, so next we have Professor Thomas Durkin, who is Assistant Professor and Associate Director at the Neuro's Early Drug Discovery Unit.
Hello, Kendra. Thanks for having us for this panel today. It was great to be here. So yeah, I work at the Montreal Neurological Institute, so I'm a assistant professor there and also a kind of associate director of our Early Drug Discovery Unit. And I guess we've been going for about 5 years now, and I think a lot of the real contributions we've made to open science over the last few years is kind of to take what we've learned and really make them into open and accessible methods, protocols, because a lot of the people would always complain that, you know, I want to do these kind of complicated methods of working with stem cells, but I don't know how to do it. And you go from lab to lab and it often leads to problems. So we always wanted to make sure our methods are out there available. We would actually be bringing in people to do training and kind of in a way demystifying it. And we've kind of also been involved with Peter McPherson involved in validating antibodies to kind of make sure that everyone uses antibodies. Oftentimes we don't know if it works or not, but we'll still spend the money. And so we're part of this kind of open initiative to see, can we really find good validated antibodies to save the community more funds in a way. And you had kind of mentioned academic failures in a way. So it was kind of hard to pick one, because the truth is it's like, or in a way, my career is like a litany of failures, from like, rejected manuscripts to rejected proposals to, job searches where you think you do really well and you get turned away. So in a way, failing all the time, it's like my successes is like my body of failure in a way. So we've kind of learned to accept failure, but I always say, if you're going to fail as much as you can, and then eventually you'll learn how to succeed then later on. So
that's a really good way of putting it. Thank you.
No problem.
All right, so next we have Professor Sylvain Baillet, who's Professor and Canada Research Chair of the Neural Dynamics of Brain Systems. He's also the Associate Dean for Research in the McGill Faculty of Medicine.
Thank you, Kendra, for the opportunity, and hi, everyone. So yes, I've been involved in, I'm afraid to say, for the past 20 years in something that we call today open science. And I think at the time, it was more an attitude towards, giving back, because it was the time when, software for neuroimaging, so I do brain imaging as a physicist. So it was the time around the year 2000 where the first software packages like SPM would be made freely available. And at the time, it was really a revolution. And I've been using some of those, and to me, it was kind of a natural attitude when I was finishing my postdoc to share back and give back the methods we were developing and try to package those as an app, as a software that everybody could use. So it started with that, and it's been we've been lucky. We've been failing a lot in getting funding, but we were eventually successful. And over the past 12 years, we've had support to develop this app called Brainstorm in my field to do brain imaging and electrophysiology. We extended it recently, or the effort towards open science in my lab, with a data repository, because it's about sharing methods and tools, but also sharing data for many good reasons we will certainly discuss later today. But also it's about sharing knowledge. So on top of sharing the material, we also share, if you will, our expertise, and we put up workshops that are open to everyone most of the time, or hosted for free at some host institutions elsewhere. Regarding my academic career and how to fail. I mean, yes, Tom and the previous discussants had exactly the same perspective. I think it's in general, when you build a career, you have to go through successes and failures. I think academic career is more exposed because it's your name, it's your lab, it's your personality that is constantly, evaluated by peers. So it's about building, some form of expertise in becoming good at failing, meaning that you have to be ready for it, and you have to learn from, and listen to what the reviewers have to say. For instance, for a paper, for a grant, for a fellowship application, and try to actually fill the gaps and become better at your application. And there is a little share of luck as well, an opportunity to go after. But overall, I think failing is part of the scientific process, because you explore threads and leads, and some of them, just don't work out. So you have to be ready to bounce back. But you have to find the thin line between perseverance, which I, consider a positive value, versus persistence, which is, you can persist in a bad way and persist in failure. So in failing.
Yeah.
So that would be my philosophy.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction to make. Thank you. All right, next we have Dylan Roskams-Edris, who is the Open Science Alliance Officer at the Neuro. Sorry, I messed that up.
That's just fine. Thank you. So my work as Open Science Alliance Officer involves two things. One, advocating for open science with other research institutes specializing in neuroscience in Canada. So reaching out to people at UBC and at Western, at Dalhousie and whatnot, in order to advocate for open science and its applicability to neuroscience. And then two, capitalizing on my less scientific background than most of the rest of you in law and ethics, in order to try to sort out some of the problems and barriers and opportunities that both law and ethics present for open science practice. And then academic failure, it's an ongoing habit that is an academic failure, which is a stubborn refusal on my part to share anything early before I feel like I've really put the final polish and accounted for everybody's interests and everybody's potential input, instead of sharing things early, because I have the fear that I'm going to be seen as inadequate, or someone who doesn't have the relevant expertise in this area or something, as opposed to realizing that no one has the relevant expertise in everything.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good lesson to learn. Something I fear as well, sharing my code before I feel like it's good enough to be read by other people. So last but not least, we have Elizabeth Dupre, who is a PhD candidate at McGill University.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I have had a bit less of a career, still being a PhD candidate, but so far I've been really lucky to get involved in several open science initiatives that I think have been really impactful, at least on me. So I was lucky to participate in Mozilla Open Leadership Training, both as a participant and as a mentor. And there I learned a lot about how to conduct research projects openly, and how to collaborate and share with people kind of across communities, which was really impactful. So I took a lot of that experience and used it when I was serving as secretary for the Organization for Human Brain Mapping Open Science Special Interest Group. And there I was able to really see kind of, at least in similar to Dr. Baillet, my own field of human brain imaging, see what kind of impacts open science could have within the OHBM community. And then separately, I've also been really lucky to get involved with several large open source projects in the Python OpenStack. And I've acted as a developer for some of those, and that's been a really enlightening experience. In terms of failure, as other people have mentioned, kind of academia is a series of failures. One I wanted to pick out because I thought it would be relevant for this panel is that I have a paper discussing the harm of paywalls that is itself paywalled. I do have a preprint of it where you can read all the text, but just to make the point that in open science, there's sometimes a pressure to do everything correctly, and that's impossible, and that we're all just doing what we can.
Thank you. Yeah, that's another good point, even relating back to Dylan's point of not being able to do everything you want to do. So now we're going to move into the section where we have some prepared questions, and these are basically organized in 3 sections. We're going to talk about the benefits of doing open science, and then the potential challenges, and finally how a grad student could begin doing open science. So first of all, and this is a question for anyone, why do you personally do open science, and how do you think doing open science in grad school benefits both the field as well as someone's personal career? And anyone is welcome to answer this question. Yep, Sylvain.
So I guess someone has to start. Like I explained briefly in my introduction, I think it's first of all, I mean, there are many good reasons why to consider, opening your science to at least collaborators and maybe the rest of the world. But to me, like I explained briefly, it's about giving back and, playing the game with the same rules with everyone, which would be, okay, if I've been lucky enough to benefit from the work from somebody else beyond publications, even though, again, access to publications, we take it for granted in our privileged institutions, but there are many countries and institutions that don't have access to published material. So beyond just publications, if you were lucky to benefit from data from somebody else, or from software or methods, or even a deck of slides where you have learned, about new things, then why not, playing the same fair game and giving back yourself if you can. So it's a matter, again, of how you approach the philosophy of science. And to me, it's the greatest motivator. And on top of that, you can add many other very good things, which is, for instance, the care or the consciousness of or the necessity of reproducible science. So of reproducing same or similar results from the same data or a greater pool of data, etc. And you can only pull data if those data sets, are freely available, or at least it makes our lives easier. Ethics issues and confidentiality issues notwithstanding. So this would be my personal motivator to keep it open and share.
Thank you. That was very good. I guess kind of going in the direction of society at large, I was wondering what you think about how attitudes are shifting towards open science and how grad students should be thinking of this. So for example, even when they're deciding where to publish, some large for-profit publishing companies are being boycotted in certain countries because of some issues relating to open access. And I was wondering if you have any comments on that or any advice for grad students thinking about where to publish.
Yes, I guess publishing is a bit more my jam. I mean, I guess I'm a bit hesitant to use the idea of like boycotting, but more like just resisting publishing in, again, more in the big publishers. So, Elsevier, Wiley, etc. And we certainly understand, like, it's a bit tricky to make that switch and that mindset shift, especially in publishing. But there are certainly, I guess, there are options available to grad students. So even if there is like a paper and you are publishing it in a, one of your traditional journals, there are resources, and happy to provide those, where you can look up sort of so if you have your preprint, and that's what you publish before your paper is peer reviewed, and then you have your postprint, and then that's basically that's after peer review, it's been accepted, but it just doesn't have all the lovely, beautiful formatting courtesy of the journal. You can put postprints, and journals have sort of rules and regulations about what you can do with your postprints. So you can put those into repositories. So just sort of making yourself aware, and it's not a big step, I think, at least from a librarian perspective, and especially working with students. It's finding those spots, and it doesn't need to be a huge big shift, but finding those little moments in your research that you can actually like, oh, well, maybe I can just make it open here, or I can do this. It doesn't need to be this, you yourself are not systemically going to change academic publishing, but it's these little moments.
Yeah, that's something really important to keep in mind, that you're not going to change the whole system on your own.
Yeah, exactly. But like identifying those points and starting early, that would be my thing. It will save you tears and beers if you start planning. You know,
that's a good point. What's the saying? Being open by design.
Exactly. Yeah, and just like as you're, in the same way that you start working through your project and your research. Well, as you're thinking about that, identifying like, oh, could I make this open? Could I make this part open?
Right.
How am I controlling for, like, am I incorporating good research data management practices in? What journals am I thinking about? And like, and some of it is going to, go really well, and some of it's going to go.
Yeah, exactly. That's important to think about.
Yeah.
Thanks. So we have another question for thinking about what are the benefits of open science. And that is, in your experience, either on a hiring committee or being hired or reviewing or submitting grants, what do these organizations or people think about open science practices? If they're looking at your resume and they see that you've been doing extra things, say, besides just completing your PhD, in order to promote open science or to make your own research more open?
So I think it's a very critical question, especially for our audience, because some of them will consider, maybe all of them are considering, getting into a research career in the private sector or academic sector. And of course, there is this awful, motto, which is publish or perish. And I think it's still true. It's not because you're going to go open publishing that and open access that you don't want to publish. It's one of the beauties of science to share again your findings with the community. But what I'm trying to say is that and it's true also for software and for data sets and etc. For papers, what is important is the demonstration of impact. So maybe I probably review dozens of applications per year in terms of career jobs, applications or fellowships or grants. And what is more and more well considered by committees is not so much the journal name. I mean, that counts still today, of course, even though we try not to, or we pretend we shouldn't pay attention to the journal name, to be very honest. But what's very important is that you document the impact that what you've been sharing, for instance, or publishing has had on your community. So often when you just get started, you don't have too many citations, right? I've seen some applications where purposely the applicant would not publish in a journal, but publish only at a bioarchive or medRxiv or even archive. But you need to explain, first of all, you need to explain the committee why you're doing it and that you've been doing it purposely. But then you need to support, and that's true also for people who publish in regular journals, you need to document the impact your publication has had so far and compare maybe with the statistics of, the same papers in your field published, at the same date. So you have to go the extra mile to explain basically why your science is impactful and how it has impacted, how your open science basically position and choices have had impact on your community. Same for software, same for data sharing, same for organizing workshops. You need to document, again, the impact. That's very critical. And I think today we have all the tools that we need to document the kind of echo your contributions have had.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really good advice. Thank you. So the next section is where we're going to be talking about what are the potential challenges for doing open science, particularly for grad students. So first, I want to just ask an open question for anyone. How has doing open science hindered your career or the career of any of your mentees?
So maybe I'll take this. I think hasn't really hindered it. It's actually helped promoted it in a way, because one area that has really helped us has actually been building collaborations both within the Neuro, McGill, and further afield. So for students coming to work with me in a way, I can actually point them onto projects we've developed in-house, and also we can actually offer them opportunities to work with a student or a professor in another institute as well. And so there's been a lot of opportunities there, and it helps kind of form collaborations, and you can go after kind of new funding initiatives. I think sometimes where we get hindered is often you get some pushback from review panels. So we've had one or two grants where, you know, reviewer one will say, this is great, I love his open concept. And then reviewer two says, no, I don't like it because there's no commercial, you know, if you're building an assay to maybe potentially do a screen to go, well, I don't see the commercialization because it's done in an open way. He'll never get IP, so I'm going to give him a 0 out of 5. So sometimes that's kind of come to bite us in the derriere in a way, but it's seldom, it's rare. A lot of people are now more amenable to open science. And I think, you know, with the whole, since we're all in this COVID world, I think when we all return, we'll see this accelerate even further now, going from a kind of conventional model more to open.
Yeah, I can see that. Did you have something to add, Sylvain?
Yeah, to add to Tom's point, and I fully agree with what he said, but again, I think if you want to go in the open, you have to go the extra mile on many different fronts. So for instance, I explained a little bit about, you know, the publishing philosophy, if you want, and explaining why you want to go in the open, sometimes to the detriment of supposedly high impact journals. But it's true also for software. You need to package your software in such a way that it's usable by somebody else. So you need to write your own documentation, explain to somebody else how to use it. Otherwise, the impact would be 0 anyway. Same for data. But for data, there is also the extra mile of getting institutional approval for sharing. Because a lot of our institutions, I'm not talking particularly about McGill, but in general, a lot of institutions have firewalls basically to prevent, or at least to control to some extent, what's getting out of the university. It could be just tools, but it could be also material and data in the first place. And if you work with humans, human participants, you need to get their consent. And here Dylan can help us a little bit more, you know, about that, to specify what it's all about. But you need to really go the extra mile about, you know, making sure you respect the regulations, the alignment, you are well aligned with your institutional guidelines and regulations, and you need to basically put everything that you share on maybe not a silver plate, but just a regular plate that doesn't collapse, so that people can use what you have to share.
Right, and actually a lot of people talk about making your research more open actually can improve your own efficiency, because as you start to organize your code and your data in a way that's usable by others, it also is more usable by yourself down the road. If, say, a few months later, when you have to make an adjustment to an analysis for a reviewer, it'll be easier if you've organized all of your work. So there is a sense of going the extra mile for sharing it, but it also benefits yourself as well in many ways. And actually this question of your institutional guidelines and following them is related to the next question I had for Dr. Silveira, actually. And I was wondering, given your experience in both in medicine and as a researcher, are there any particular challenges that many PhD students at McGill might be facing if they do medical research and they want to make their research more open?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think this is a challenge. I think Sylvain brought it up. We mentioned before about starting early, and it has to be as early as before your ethics consent. So you have to make sure that it's all approved by the participants. And often, like, one challenge is, for instance, for people that work with data that was collected many years ago when this was not so in place yet. So to go back to reconsent, for instance, sometimes is impossible. So then it's complicated to really go over. So this is a really important challenge, especially if you're using human data, phenotypes, things like that.
Thank you. So the next question is also related to a challenge students at McGill might be facing, specifically in neuroscience, where a lot of people are maybe not doing their methods in an automated way. They can't do it in an automated way because they're working with cells or doing a lot of manual steps in their analysis and data collection. And I was wondering, particularly from Thomas Durkin, what your advice would be on sharing your methods if you don't have a fully automated set of code that people could rerun.
So the way we've kind of approached it is because when we work with stem cells in a way, sometimes it is a bit artisanal in a way. So we always try to write our protocols where it's like, this is roughly the procedure you would follow, but then oftentimes you kind of gain an acquired learning when you do the protocol, so that when we write it, we also say, put in your observations so that maybe you see this and this will indicate that maybe this cell is unhealthy, or maybe you've got a factor wrong here. So then, and in a way, almost add all these technical notes. And then by doing that, you've combined all the knowledge. And then once it goes out there, it almost teaches people, this is the protocol, but just because you go down, it's not like sequencing where you get your DNA, you sequence it, you have a sequence. It might be that your cell grows this way or this way, but you have to interpret it in different ways. So it's a difficult thing to do. It's a challenging thing to do, but it's like baking a cake in a way. We all know how to bake a cake, but there's 20 different ways to do it. But it's just to be mindful of how can you, maybe if you see this cake rise higher than another, why might it be so? And then how will you then build this into your interpretation of the data at the end of it?
Right. And what kind of advice would you give for people who wanted to share their notes like that? Perhaps in a paper, they wouldn't be able to include all of these detailed methods that they used.
So there's been a real big momentum push in terms of open notebooking. And so one of the groups has been the Structural Genomics Consortium. They've kind of have their open lab notebooks. And I have a lot of grad students, postdocs in different institutes where sometimes they just literally blog about like a Western blot they did, or an actual structure they did, or even a cell experiment. And by putting that out there, it kind of gets feedback early, and that they can actually incorporate it into the next round of experiments. But by doing it this way, they've also kind of linked into this platform Zenodo, so that if you actually put anything out there, it links to a DOI. And then this DOI, at least you always have an online record of it, and you can still reference it. You can add it into your papers, your posters, and it's still a record that this is your work. But right. You can then kind of build on it then further on. So it shows that you're publishing, and maybe it's not in peer-reviewed journals, but you do have a record of your work going online, and you can show it to job interviewers or your committee members and stuff down the road as you build towards maybe a peer-reviewed paper.
Right, thanks. Yeah, that's an important point in open science, that when you're sharing these different research objects, there are ways like using a DOI to make them still trackable and like have a consistent link, so that if you publish your paper, you can provide links to these other research objects. Thanks. So the next section, we're going to be talking about how a grad student could begin doing open science. And I guess the first question would be, what are your advice for the first steps a grad student can take, even if they're potentially in a lab that doesn't do open science as like a regular thing? Yeah.
I think what is very important is to have a discussion with the supervisor, right? Especially like you said, Kendra, if the culture in the lab presently is not that of going open systematically or on a regular basis. So it's very important to make sure that everyone shares the same view and same vision about what it means exactly to go open on a specific project. That avoids possible misunderstandings between the supervisor and the student further down the road at the moment of publishing or pushing the data out there. And of course, nobody wants to be in that situation. So it's better to anticipate and have this discussion. And if the supervisor needs to be educated on, often they don't have, depending on the field and the generation, etc., they don't have a clue, or they have a very fuzzy idea about what it means. So I think it's your mission, you young generation and students, to actually, elevate the standards in the lab where you are sitting or working, I should say. And, and for that, you need to, take the time and be very, convincing. Maybe establish a workshop or show what a hackathon session looks like. You name it, right? But it's important to prepare the road forward.
Yeah, so that's an important point to keep in mind, is to have conversations in your lab. There might be restrictions you're not aware of, so you want to make sure that everybody's on the same, has the same idea of what can be shared within the lab. Anybody else have an idea for a simple thing a grad student can do to make that? Yeah, Andrea.
I mean, is sort of going off of that point is also framing it as like, it doesn't need to be done again all at once. Like, maybe it doesn't even need to be the final paper. Maybe it's a conference poster. You can put conference posters. So McGill has a repository. It's called eScholarship. You can put your posters in there. Like, that's fine. It doesn't need to be the whole kit and caboodle. Does not need to be open right away. There are, again, identifying those small steps, and especially for labs where, if open is a new thing, like, generally publishing is one of the easier ways to get people sort of on board. And like, I'm here, I'm happy to talk to people, like, and sort of provide resources and ideas about how to go about doing that, at least with publishing. And then we can, maybe work on to like Open Science Framework and
that's
places where you can put
a good idea. Yeah. So when you're having these conversations, you can kind of think strategically about which aspects of the research might be easiest or most palatable to make open at the start.
Yeah. Pick your battles.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, Patricia, I think you had something, and then Elizabeth.
I think that the advice given by Andrea is very important, the little pieces, because to go open is a huge amount of work. To be able to deliver the silver plate that Sylvain was talking about before, to make it intelligible to other people, either code or data, it's a huge amount of work. It's very intense. So to see the way Andrea is proposing, like breaking in little pieces that you could put openly there faster, I think it's extremely interesting.
Thanks. Elizabeth, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I want to 100% echo these messages. I think it's really kind of something that's hard to grasp and easy to forget. And for me, I think Dr. Christina Bergman shared a metaphor that I love, which is open science is a buffet. So just you can go to the buffet as many times as you want, and you don't have to take everything all at once. You just take the pieces you want, and then you can come back and it's still there. And I think having it as a metaphor helps to return to it when I'm feeling a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's a really good metaphor to keep in mind. Cool.
If I could just add one quick thing, there's also a pretty substantial variety of like open science MOOCs and blogs, and like people have been writing in this area and specifically about this getting started in open science issue. So you're not the first one. Don't think that you're the first one. Do your literature review, see what other people have said, and then get from that experience, build your own approach.
Really. So I guess that goes nicely into the next question, which is what resources are there particularly at McGill? And then the next question is beyond McGill for starting to do open science.
I mean, I guess I am a resource. But I guess one of the easiest ones is we have an institutional scholarship called e-scholarship. And if you, I mean, Dylan wrote a really good blog post about that. Actually, Dylan, do you want to talk about your blog post or in your article for eMed?
I mean, I could just do it in no time at all. I wrote it for the Neuro blog. It was about, well, we figured out that this e-scholarship at McGill is a thing. How easy is it to use? And the result was actually like pretty darn easy, just by adding one step, which is when you receive your kind of post-print proofs from a journal, you can immediately send them off to e-scholarship at McGill. They'll check into copyright restrictions, embargo restrictions, all of the above, and then they'll put it in the repository as a postprint so that even if it's in a closed journal, preferably there's no embargo period, but people will be able to access it there. That's one super easy thing that you can just add as one step in your workflow, and at some point that article will be open even if it's published in a closed journal.
Yeah, that's really great. And we'll be sharing a list of resources following this video, so I can include that blog post so that grad students can have this very easy step that they can use to start doing open science. So I'm curious to hear from Elizabeth, who's had a lot of experience outside of McGill doing open science as a grad student. I'd like to hear what advice you have for how to seek out these communities outside McGill for doing open science, and what kind of training you could do outside of McGill.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was really lucky in that I went to what is now called Neuro Academy in its first iteration as Neuro Hack Week. And I was exposed there to a lot of these ideas Dylan was talking about, kind of how do you start doing open science and what does the onboarding look like. And since then, I've been kind of amazed by the number of summer schools that have come about that provide kind of a really nice introduction to these resources and these practices in a supportive environment. So I know here in Montreal, we have Montreal Brain Hack School. Neuro Academy is ongoing. I just saw that Neuro Match is going to start its own summer school. So there's a lot of communities that are interested and invested in helping students find ways internationally to kind of connect and to access open science resources. So I know for me, kind of going to those summer schools, or at least the ones I've been to, have made a huge difference and really clued me into the possibilities there. So as a first step, I would definitely say there are lots of amazing summer schools. They will teach you lots of things. I would check them out.
Yeah, that's great. And then another thing that's often promoted in these summer schools also is this idea of hackathons and coding together. Now, obviously not everyone in neuroscience is doing a lot of coding, but for those who are, maybe particularly in neuroimaging, there are a few really great hackathons that go on yearly. And Elizabeth, you know a lot about this, so if you wouldn't mind, you say one or two sentences about why you think these are beneficial and what people could learn there.
No, absolutely. So similar to the summer schools, it's just a slightly different focus. So it is a community that kind of comes together. But with the hackathons, what's nice is depending on the particular organization, they come together at different amounts. So for example, one community I'm really familiar with is the Brain Hack community, which is specifically for open neuroimaging. But we have several events. So there's a hackathon that takes place every year at the Organization for Human Brain Mapping, which will be totally online this year and could be a really fun thing to check out. There's also events called Brain Hack Global, where the emphasis is to try and get researchers globally working on problems at the same time. So there are sites all over the world. Anyone can join on and kind of join a project happening internationally. But the nice thing about all of these kind of organizations is that they're really invested in helping new people on board. So I know, at least for me, when I started, like, I had no formal training in computer science. I was just kind of figuring things out as I went, and the word hackathon was a lot. It did not sound like something that was made for me or that I should be at, but it was really lucky in that I did end up going to some of these events. And I was really kind of blown away by how supportive people were and how people were so interested in helping new people start. And like Dr. Baillet said, I think a lot of people are inspired by a sense of giving back to the community, because now it's been around long enough that it's helped grown so many people into kind of the researchers they are today, that it's really a supportive place to be. So BrainHack's the one I'm most familiar with, but I do know there are a number of others out there for different communities.
Yeah, and these events are not only good for learning to code, but it also helps you build a network with other scientists who are interested in open science and who are perhaps doing similar science. So it's a great networking place as well.
If I could do just a super brief plug for being some very easy things to access in. I read the Open Science newsletter every week. I also listen to the Orion Open Science podcast. I mean, I don't know about other people, but in the COVID situation, I'm listening to more podcasts than I ever have before. So there's also the COMP, Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform podcast. So if you just want a while you're doing dishes, super gentle introduction, download some of those and have a listen and see what you think.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll include these links in the resource we provide afterwards as well. So now we're going to move on to some questions from the audience. So first question I have here is, I'd really like to openly release my study data, but my institutional REB is not approving ethics applications for studies asking for patient consent for open release of any kind of human data, despite being an open science institute. What should I do?
I mean, I suppose I should at least partially take that one. We were talking about barriers earlier. Ethics is a big one in the human space, in the human studies space. It's not a big problem with, animals and whatnot, but when it comes to releasing human data, there's a lot of touchiness. One of the aspects of the touchiness comes from the fact that REBs are kind of inherently conservative. They like to do what has been approved before, not necessarily to be experimental. What I would recommend is, before you even start your study, go talk to the people who are responsible for the REB. And when you go talk to them, bring the arguments that they are likely to listen to, because they're concerned with patient privacy and all of that. But there are a lot of really good ethical arguments for why sharing human data is the ethical thing to do, to make sure that it's appropriately reused, to make sure that we generate treatments as quickly as possible, to respect the autonomy of participants, because they may choose, if given the option, to share their data because they're suffering from something and they want to help as much as possible. These are the types of arguments that ethics boards might actually listen to, as opposed to, what do you mean I just want to be able to share my data?
Right. And now there are examples of some really large scale open data projects that you could cite and give as examples as, institutions that are respected who are willing to share human data. So
definitely bring as many of those examples as you possibly can, because if you can show that other REBs or IRBs or whatever the appropriate acronym is have been sharing data and have been approving this, that'll make it much more likely, as opposed to, here's this brand new idea, please just let me do what I want to do.
Got to show precedence, right, in law terms.
There you go.
All right, so next question is, what solution could we implement to help navigate grad students with the tension between the desire to work with open science practices and often resistance from PIs who have to account for the current credit system in academia?
I mean, it's a difficult question because, like Dylan said, for the REB, it's the same for the academic tradition. It's very odd, but on campuses where innovation and forward-looking ideas are supposed to be developed, well, often these institutions are very, very conservative with respect to, again, preserving those traditions. So I think it's a matter of discussion, and it's a matter of also convincing your PIs that there is an added value to sharing. And so maybe to backpedal a little bit, there was a question regarding the evaluation of PIs, the evaluation also of students in their, let's say, fellowship applications. and based on open science contributions. So you may be interested in the info that all the Faculty of Medicines in Quebec have met and discussed this idea about how we could, move that thing forward, especially in the evaluations of the PIs by their departments. Every year, PIs are evaluated in the research that they do. And it's very true at McGill and elsewhere also in Quebec and most probably most of the world, in Canada in particular, that there is no box where you can document basically your open science contributions. So it's usually the list of publications, the amount of money you brought back with grants, and that's it. So we reached out to the FRQS and to our deans in the faculties of medicine, and they co-signed basically a letter to actually, the deans co-signed a letter sent to the FRQS to actually promote the idea that at FRQS, fellowship applications, grant applications, in the forms we have to fill out, there needs to be a space where you can, again, explain your position and your vision and philosophy about open science and the impact it has had on the community so far in terms of your own production. So I'm not sure this is currently, in effect. I know that some committees at FRQS, for instance, are looking into this, especially or FRQNT for informatics and computer science. They have this portion. But the reality, especially in biology and neuroscience, is that sharing and even computing, tools and apps are being produced by those labs as well, FRQS labs and PIs and students. So there needs to be a room for evaluation or evaluating those things. And we want to work our way backward now, and we want to convince the deans and the chairs of the departments, especially at McGill, to have this box available and weighted with the same weight than the regular publication box and grant box, to have open science contributions or sharing contributions better highlighted.
Right, so then hopefully with a little bit of acknowledgement from above, but also maybe some push from younger researchers, we might be able to change the culture a little bit. So PIs will be more accepting of open science practices in their students. That's great. So the next question is quantifying the output of scientists inevitable? What ways of quantifying output have you seen that have less bad intended effects? Okay. I guess this is very much related to what you just asked, but I guess other than just, I guess the heart of the question, is it inevitable that we have these ways that we're being quantified and being evaluated?
Yeah, well, I would have two things to say. One, we do like to quantify, but always keep in mind Goddard's law, that as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We see this with impact factor right now and the gaming of it. And two, I prefer methods of like qualification as opposed to quantification. So if you look at impact factor, it's all about assessing a rank. But if you look at like transparency factors that are being done by things like the Center for Open Science, they will give either like a badge or a check mark to a journal based on its transparency practices. But this doesn't put them in like a ranking from 1 to 0. It's not you're the most, it's that you adopt these, set of practices, so you're in the open group. We're not going to give you a rank within that open group, but you're in the open, and then, a journal might be in the second open group because they're not engaging in quite so many open practices. So you can still have like this is good, this is less good, this is less good, but without having this like super stratified 1 to 100 competition.
And I suppose in some way, given that academia is a competitive field, there will always be some kind of metric. But I guess maybe an aim within this system where we can't completely get rid of metrics might be to change the metrics so we're recognizing different kinds of contributions. So someone just commented, in my view, when it comes to publishing human data and medical AI models, adversarial attacks on models and also privacy violation attacks should be taken into account. What is your opinion?
I'm not sure what he means by adversarial attacks on models. I know what it means from a, let's say, computer science point of view. But in terms of privacy violation attacks, I think it's difficult. It's a difficult issue, but this is why working with your REB and having the proper infrastructure to share your data is really essential. So of course, anonymization is really key, but sometimes you think that you have anonymized, and just by removing the names of your participants from the file, and well, people can be identified with other things like cross-referencing, for instance, the date of birth with the date of visit to the lab, with other things, or just looking at the scalp shape from the MRI, for instance, these kind of things we haven't thought about before. So, of course, we cannot. It's hard to prevent, any possible attack, because hackers and people who have evil, motivations are very hard to predict, and they are unfortunately very creative. But it's important to work with your REB to make sure you have all the well-identified steps and checkboxes, in your procedures and in your protocol, being well documented and respected. And it's super crucial to have the appropriate, informatic infrastructure to make sure that there is no violation of confidentiality with your subjects.
Yeah, this comes back to being open by design, where you should be starting to think about this way in the beginning when you're planning the study. All right, so
I would just add one quick thing.
Okay.
Consents as well. Just that they should also be included. This kind of risk should also be something that is communicated to participants,
right.
Because if it's something you can't guarantee 100% about, then at least what you can do is flag that there is a risk, and ask people to consciously take that decision. As opposed
there's
to
always the possibility that somebody will discover a new way of linking the identity to someone that you didn't know about when you publish the data. So it's important to be open about that in your consent forms.
Exactly.
Great. All right, so last question. During academic life, some people will have their open science red pill moment. For those of us at the PhD level, we have to publish 2 to 3 papers to graduate. What do you make of these semi-official requirements, and how do you think about this? Is it a problem, or is it a good way to help structure a PhD? I guess essentially, is it a good idea to make publishing papers the requirement of getting a PhD?
I think, if I may start the discussion on that, I think there is no official requirement that you publish 2 or 3 papers to get your PhD or your master's. I think what the graduate school requires from you and your supervisors, so to speak, is the fact that you have produced enough material so that it is organized. It can be organized as a story, as a thesis, under 2 or 3 chapters. Of course, the tradition is to convert those chapters or even write those chapters as papers, but there is no formal requirement, unless I'm really mistaken here, which is very possible, that for instance, the IPN expects from you to publish 3 papers for your PhD. So that's a little bit of relief, right? But of course, I think it's a motivation, first of all, to envision to drive your project as something you can share with the rest of the world.
Right.
And again, what's better than publishing in one shape or form the output of your research and share it with everyone. So I think it's reasonable to be in the mindset of working hard enough and well enough so that at the end of the day you can tell a story rigorously through as in the shape of a paper or a blog post or whatever, but something that can be read by somebody else.
Right. It's not always about the actual publication. There are other modes of communication. Exactly. All right, well, that's all we have time for today. Thanks very much to all of you panelists for joining me today and for everyone watching and submitting questions. So for anyone watching, if you're interested in learning more, we'll be sending out an email with a link to additional resources and to a recording of this discussion. So if you're interested, you can follow the link that's posted in the YouTube description, or here I'm going to share the QR code so that you'll be able to access it. Here, sorry, it's hard to talk and figure this out at the same time. So here is the QR code and the link to the form, which, like I said, is also in the YouTube description, where you can submit your email if you want more resources. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kendra. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thank you very much.